The greatest lesson of history is that you can never step in the same river twice. You know, that quote from Heraclitus? It's really about constant change, isn't it? Especially when we look at something as big as human populations.
Absolutely. Demographics are always shifting, always flowing, and those shifts, well, they change pretty much everything else.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're jumping into a really significant, maybe often overlooked, shift happening worldwide, the changing face of religious affiliation.
Yeah, and this isn't just, numbers on a page. These trends shape societies, cultures, even global politics.
Definitely. And our guide for this deep dive is a huge piece of work by the Pew Research Center. They pulled together data from, what, over 2,700 sources?
That's right. Censuses, surveys, population registers, covering that really crucial decade from 2010 to 2020. It's incredibly comprehensive.
So understanding this is, well, it's vital, wouldn't you say, whether you're just trying to make sense of the news or maybe looking ahead at social trends?
Or especially if you're preparing for competitive exams like the UPSC. Grasping these kinds of fundamental demographic shifts, it's absolutely core stuff for several papers. This is kind of a shortcut to getting up to speed on a really complex but important topic.
Exactly. So our mission today, unpack what Pew found, what were the big shifts in religion globally, what's driving these changes, and, what does it all mean?
Okay, let's get into it.
So let's start with the big picture, 2010 to 2020. What happened overall?
Well, first off, the world population grew quite a bit. And so in just raw numbers, most religious groups also grew. More people on Earth meant, more Christians, more Muslims, more Hindus.
And more people with no religion, too.
Right, and significantly more people with no religious affiliation, yes. But the really interesting story emerges when you look at the share each group represents, the proportion of the global population. That's where the real movement is.
Right. So who was the biggest group in 2020? Still Christians.
Still Christians, yes. They clocked in at about 2.3 billion people. That's a gain of over 120 million in 10 years, which sounds like a lot.
It does sound like a lot.
But compared to how fast the world population grew overall, their share actually slipped. It fell by almost 2 percentage points down to just under 29%. So they didn't quite keep pace.
Okay, so Christians grew in number but lost ground proportionally. Who gained that ground?
The two big gainers were Muslims and the religiously unaffiliated, often called the knowns. Muslims were clearly the fastest growing group, both in numbers and share.
How fast?
Their population jumped by nearly 350 million people. That pushed their global share up by almost 2 percentage points, landing them at roughly 25.6% of the world's population. That's a really significant shift in just one decade.
Wow, 350 million. That's like adding several large countries worth of people. And the knowns, the religiously unaffiliated. You said they grew massively, too.
Oh, absolutely. The religiously unaffiliated. This is a really diverse group, right? Atheists, agnostics, people who just don't identify with any particular religion. They actually became the world's third largest group.
Third largest, ahead of Hindus.
Ahead of Hindus in 2020, yes. Their numbers swelled by about 270 million, reaching 1.9 billion people. And their share of the global population also rose by nearly a full percentage point, hitting just over 24%.
So in just 10 years, Christians slip a bit in share, Muslims gain quite a bit, and the nones also gain significantly. What happened with other major faiths? Hindus, Buddhists?
Right, Hindus.
Yeah.
Their story is more about stability in terms of share. They grew by over 120 million people, reaching about 1.2 billion. But their share held remarkably steady at just under 15% globally.
Okay, holding steady.
Jews also grew in numbers, getting close to 15 million worldwide, and also held steady in share, around 0.2%. Buddhists were the outlier. They were the only major group that actually saw a slight decrease in their absolute numbers, down by about 19 or 20 million people to just over 300 million. And their global share slipped quite noticeably by almost a full percentage point, down to about 4%.
Interesting, a decrease in numbers. And the smaller faiths.
The category Pew uses is all other religions. That group held its share steady at around 2.2%. So if you put it all together, what the study found was that the overall share of the world's population that identifies with any religion, it actually dipped slightly, from nearly 77% in 2010 down to about 76% in 2020.
And that dip basically mirrors the rise of the religiously unaffiliated share.
Precisely. One goes down slightly, the other goes up by a similar amount.
That's quite a bit of change packed into just 10 years. So what does Pew say is causing these shifts? It's obviously not random.
No, not at all. The study really zeroes in on two main engines driving these changes at the global level. First, there's natural increase that's simply births minus deaths within a group.
Okay, demographics 101.
Pretty much. And the second key mechanism is religious switching. That's when people change their religious identity as adults, different from how they were raised.
And migration, does that play a role?
Migration is hugely important for how religious groups change within specific countries or regions, absolutely. But it doesn't change the global total for a religious group, if you see what I mean. Someone moving from country A to country B is still counted in the global total. So for these global shifts, it's really about natural increase in switching.
Got it. Let's talk about switching first. That sounds like it must be a big part of the story for the knowns.
It's absolutely critical for understanding their growth. Pew looks specifically at adults, aged 18 to 54, people old enough to have potentially made a switch. They compared childhood religion to current religion.
And what did they find?
A really significant net flow out of identifying with a religion and into that religiously unaffiliated category.
How significant are we talking?
The ratio they found is quite stark. For every one adult in that age range who switched into religion after being raised without one, 3.2 adults switched out of the religion they were raised in to become unaffiliated.
Wow. Over 3 leave for everyone joining, essentially.
That's the net flow into the none category from those raised religious, yes. It's a powerful dynamic.
And that really explains how the nuns can grow so much, right? Because the study also mentions they tend to have lower fertility rates, maybe an older age structure than some other groups.
Exactly. Switching is what helps them overcome that potential demographic disadvantage. It's a major source of their growth, especially in certain parts of the world.
Which groups lost the most people through this switching?
Well, given the overall trends, it's probably not surprising that Christians saw the biggest net losses from switching. The ratio was about 3.1 leaving Christianity for every one person who switched in.
Okay. Anyone else see big losses?
Buddhists also had net losses from switching, though not as dramatic. About 1.8 Buddhists left the faith via switching for everyone who joined.
And Hindus and Muslims.
Switching seems much less common for them, according to the study. Muslims actually had slightly more people switching in than switching out, though the numbers were small. Hindus had slightly more leaving than joining. But again, the overall impact of switching on their global numbers was minor compared to Christians or Buddhists.
Right. So switching is a huge factor for the knowns gaining share, and for Christians and to some extent Buddhists losing share. What about the other engine natural increase? Births minus deaths.
Natural increase is really where demographics like age structure and fertility rates come into play. And globally, the group that gained the absolute most from natural increase between 2010 and 2020 was Muslims.
Why is that?
Generally speaking, the global Muslim population has a younger age structure, meaning more people in their prime reproductive years and, on average, higher fertility rates compared to other major groups. More births relative to deaths just leads to faster natural growth.
And Christians, they grew by a lot too.
Yes. Christians had the second highest gains from natural increase, globally speaking. Still substantial growth from births exceeding deaths.
How about the others?
The religiously unaffiliated saw sort of modest natural growth. And Buddhists, as we noted, their numbers slightly declined, actually had slightly more deaths than births globally during this period, contributing to that decline.
And geography must be massive here, right? Where people live affects birth rates.
Oh, hugely. It's a critical overlay. Groups that are heavily concentrated in regions with really fast overall population growth, think sub-Saharan Africa, parts of the Middle East, North Africa region, they naturally benefit from the higher birth rates common in those areas.
So who benefits most from that?
Well, both Muslims and Christians have very large and growing populations in sub-Saharan Africa, which is experiencing some of the highest population growth rates in the world. That really boosts their global natural increase numbers.
And the flip side?
The flip side is that groups like the religiously unaffiliated and Buddhists are much more concentrated in regions with slower overall population growth, like Europe and parts of the Asia-Pacific. So their potential for natural increase is lower just based on location. Though it's interesting, the study also notes that sometimes, even when you control for geography, you still see differences in fertility rates between religious groups.
What might cause that?
It could be linked to all sorts of socioeconomic factors, things like average education levels, particularly for women, access to family planning, women's participation in the workforce. These can vary sometimes even between religious groups living in the same country.
So it's a complex mix, group demographics plus the environment they're in. The study also looked at economic development, didn't it? Is there a connection between how developed a country is and its religious landscape?
Yes. They looked at the Human Development Index, the HDI score, which combines life expectancy, education, and income. and generally they found a correlation. Countries with higher HDI scores, more developed countries, tend to have lower overall rates of religious affiliation reported among their populations. And conversely, countries with lower HDI scores tend to have higher rates of religious affiliation.
Is that always the case? A strict rule?
Not entirely. Like most big social trends, there are important exceptions and nuances. For instance, many Muslim-majority countries show high levels of religious affiliation across different development levels within them. Same for places like India, Nepal, Israel. High affiliation persists. So it's a general pattern, not an iron law. Culture definitely matters.
But that pattern does help explain some things we talked about earlier.
It does. It helps explain where we're seeing some of the biggest shifts. The countries where Christian shares are shrinking fastest or where the knowns are growing most rapidly. They often tend to be these higher HDI countries in Europe, the Americas, Australia, New Zealand, parts of East Asia.
That makes sense. Okay, let's shift focus slightly to the actual geographic distribution.
Yeah.
Where are these groups concentrated? Did the centers of gravity change much?
Well, the Asia-Pacific region is still dominant for several groups. It's home to the vast majority of the world's Hindus, Buddhists, religiously unaffiliated, and those in the other religions category. And a majority of Muslims live there too.
But Christianity is more spread out.
Christianity is the most geographically dispersed, yes.
Yeah.
But the most striking shift geographically is for Christians. Their center of gravity has moved dramatically
Moved where?
to sub-Saharan Africa. As of 2020, Pew estimates that over 30%, nearly a third of all the world's Christians, now live in sub-Saharan Africa.
More than in Europe.
Yes, significantly more than in Europe, which now accounts for about 22%. This is a huge demographic shift. It's driven by that combination of high natural increase rates in Africa and, on the other side, significant religious disaffiliation happening in Western Europe especially. It's really reshaping what global Christianity looks like.
A fundamental shift. Any other big geographic moves?
There was also a notable shift for the global Jewish population. The study found that the largest number of Jews now live in the Middle East, North Africa region.
Really? More than North America?
Slightly more, yes. About 46% in the Middle East, North Africa region compared to around 41% in North America. And that's primarily driven by population growth within Israel, which is home to the vast majority of Jews in that region.
So the demographic heartland for some major world religions is literally moving on the map. That's fascinating. What about changes within countries? Did the study highlight places with really big shifts, say over 5% change in a group's share?
It did. And Christians saw their share shrink substantially by 5 percentage points or more in the largest number of countries, 40 countries in total.
Mostly where?
Mostly in the Americas and Europe. And this includes those notable cases where Christians actually dropped below the 50% majority mark during that decade, places like the UK, Australia, France, Uruguay.
Any countries where the Christian share grew substantially?
Only one, according to this analysis, Mozambique. Everywhere else, it was either stable or declining substantially.
That's stark. And the religiously unaffiliated, where did their share jump the most?
They saw substantial share increases in the most countries, 35 countries around the world. This includes some really big jumps, like in the US, Uruguay, Chile, Australia, where their share went up by 13, 15, even 17 percentage points in just 10 years.
That U.S. figure always draws attention. Can you give a bit more details?
Sure. The U.S. now has the second largest absolute number of religiously unaffiliated people globally, over 100 million of them. That puts the U.S. ahead of Japan in raw numbers of nuns.
But the share is different.
Right. That 100 million represents about 30% of the U.S. population, which is significant but much lower than the share in Japan, where it's closer to 57%, or especially China.
And China is still #1 for nuns.
By far. Pew estimates around 1.3 billion religiously unaffiliated people in China, making up about 90% of the population. They do note that they refined their methods for estimating this in China, trying to account for how religious identity or zongjiao is understood there, which contributed to that very high figure. It just underscores how tricky measuring this can be across different cultures.
That difference between absolute numbers and share is crucial.
Okay, what about Muslims at the country level? Did their share change drastically in many places?
Not as much as you might expect given their rapid global growth. Their share rose substantially 5 points or more in only a few countries, like Kazakhstan, Benin, Lebanon. And it actually dropped substantially in a couple, like Tanzania and Oman.
So the global growth isn't really about huge share gains in lots of individual countries?
Not primarily, no. It's more driven by the high overall population growth in countries where Muslims already make up a large part or even the majority of the population. Their numbers are growing rapidly where they already are, if that makes sense.
It does. Any notable country-level change for Buddhists?
The main one highlighted was a significant decline in the Buddhist share of the population in South Korea.
Okay. One last angle the study looked at was whether people live as part of a religious majority or minority in their country. What did that show?
It confirmed what you might intuitively expect. Most people globally, about 80%, live in a country where their own religious group is in the majority. Who's most likely to be in the majority?
Hindus. About 97% of Hindus live in India or Nepal, where they form the majority. Muslims, Christians, and the religiously unaffiliated are also quite likely to live in a majority setting for their group, around 80% for each.
And least likely.
Buddhists and Jews. Fewer than half of the world's Buddhists and Jews live in countries where their respective religion is the majority faith.
Did the number of majority countries change over the decade?
Yes, there was a notable change. The number of Christian majority countries actually decreased from 124 down to 120.
And that's directly linked to those share declines we talked about.
Exactly. Countries like the UK, France, Australia, Uruguay falling below the 50% Christian mark meant they were no longer counted as Christian majority.
Did any other group gain majority countries?
The religiously unaffiliated did. The number of countries where nuns form the majority increased from 7 to 10. The Netherlands, Uruguay, and New Zealand were added to that list. The number of Muslim, Buddhist, or Jewish majority countries didn't change during this period.
Okay, this has been incredibly detailed. We've covered a lot of ground on global religious shifts from 2010 to 2020 based on this Pew data. If we had to boil it down, what are the absolute core takeaways?
I'd say there are a few key narratives. First, the world is growing, but the share identifying with any religion is slightly shrinking overall. Second, the big growth stories are Muslims, driven mainly by natural increase, and the religiously unaffiliated, driven significantly by religious switching, especially away from Christianity.
And third?
Third, the geography is shifting. The center of Christianity is moving decisively towards sub-Saharan Africa. And disaffiliation is really reshaping the landscape in Europe and the Americas, leading to fewer Christian majority countries and more unaffiliated majority ones. Those are the major dynamics.
And connecting this back to our listeners, why is really digging into this data so important, whether you're studying for exams or just trying to understand the world?
Because these aren't just abstract numbers. They reflect fundamental changes in how people live, identify, and form societies. For anyone preparing for exams like UPSC, this is pure gold. It feeds directly into understanding social issues, population dynamics, cultural change, even international relations.
Right. You can see how religious demographics would influence migration patterns, social policies, identity politics.
Exactly. And for everyone else, it just provides that crucial, data-driven context for making sense of the news, understanding cultural shifts happening around you, maybe even anticipating future social debates. It helps you understand the why behind some big global changes.
It really sets the stage for deeper thinking, doesn't it? You start asking questions like, what does the growth of the nuns mean for public life or secularism in different countries?
Or how does Christianity changing its geographic center affect its global interactions or priorities?
And what is the persistence of high religious affiliation in places like India or many Muslim majority nations tell us about how development and religion interact? It's not always a simple story.
Precisely. The data doesn't give easy answers, but it gives us a much clearer picture of the questions we should be asking. It helps us recognize these powerful trends shaping our world.
Well, this journey through the Pew Research Center's findings from 2010 to 2020 has certainly given us a vital snapshot of a world in flux. We've seen the numbers, the proportions, the drivers like births and switching.
It really is a dynamic picture, offering, I think, invaluable insights into where societies might be heading.
So to leave you, our listeners, with something to think about, here's a final thought. We've talked about these religious shifts. How do you think they will interact with other massive global trends like aging populations in some regions, ongoing urbanization, different paces of economic growth? How will all these forces coming together reshape societies, identities, maybe even global cooperation or conflict in the decades ahead?
That's the big question, isn't it? How do all these complex trends intersect?
Indeed. If you found this deep dive helpful, especially if you're using this kind of analysis for your studies or just to stay informed, please do take a moment to like and subscribe to the Deep Dive feed.
And please share your thoughts or questions in the comments. If you have reflections on these trends or specific queries, especially how this might relate to broader studies, we'd love to hear from you. Thanks for joining us.